So we're going to open it. We're going to open up to both of our speakers because this is concluding this first panel here. So we have Dave and Tom to join us and continue in this discussion about community planning and that landscape component to this. So if the other people have questions for Dave, we can keep this dialogue going.
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any creative suggestions for trying to open up evacuation routes that go over private property and ways to address private landowners' concerns about public access, but also making places available during emergency. Have you seen anything that's worked to address both things?
I've seen everything. People that don't want to open their gates, you know, locked gates on private roads. But in an ideal case, I know somebody brought up wineries. I don't understand why the wineries wouldn't be open to an MOU that would say during an extreme event like the Tubbs fire, we would have access to this road, and that's all we would need just for that brief few hours or less to be able to head in the other direction. Some of these roads, like the ones in Santa Barbara I've seen, they're not that good. They actually look quite dangerous. If it's a dirt road heading through Chaparral, you know, that's pretty scary, especially if it's a long, infrequently traveled road. But if the road off the back of your land or your community is a well-paved road into vineyards, I don't know why you couldn't, why a winery wouldn't even enjoy the PR, community-wise, the goodwill of saying that that road will be available, you know, if needed. There is no general rule. It's every case is individual.
Yes, here's another example about vineyards. I have a friend that lived up on Atlas Peak Road, and she had vineyards and a home. Well, her home was toast very quickly, and it's a one-way road up, and she ran into her own vineyards in the middle of the vineyards, and that's where she plopped, and she survived. And there are lots of vineyards throughout our WUI, and I think that it's worth us discussing with the vineyard owners, not only road use, but also this type of evacuation for the extreme situation. So this worked, and I'd like to see it examined more fully.
That one I've never heard of.
Okay, Tadashi?
Yeah, thanks. So sort of a two-pronged question for both of you. One would be, you mentioned like traffic engineers and Tom, and my question related to that is if you were a community and you were wanting to start a dialogue or engage with your community about creating an evacuation plan, what groups would you sort of invite into that conversation?
Emergency managers and traffic engineers. Yeah, the traffic engineers in their day-to-day life, they're thinking about commuting, and they're thinking about things like, should we put a roundabout in over here, you know, or the beautiful roads that we have surrounding us around this campus are a good example of kind of what traffic engineers think about, signal timing, and they don't think about the emergency case that much. And so if you bring them together with the emergency managers and talk about potential evacuation scenarios and what intersections would everybody converge, you know, for this scenario, and how can we figure out how to stage evacuations? You know, if the fire is going to come from over the mountain, then the people closest to it should go first. You know, that sort of thing. But I think those are the two main groups that I can think of.
Thanks. And for Dave, how do you think some of the map products that you were talking about, can those be used to inform or identify the problem fires that were sort of talked about a little bit earlier, sort of identifying where fire is going to come from, or help inform the planning process?
I certainly hope so. Was that a seated question? Tadashi and I work together pretty closely, and I didn't seat it. You'll notice that there have been some catastrophic fires in the history of California co-occurring in the exact same place. While the 1923 North Berkeley fire has been alluded to here, and the 1991 tunnel fire has been alluded to, The tunnel area burned in 1947 and 1971. I may have my dates just slightly off there, but it had 3 fires in about a roughly 30-year period, and they all destroyed more than a dozen homes. Obviously, the last one, the most severe. We have the witness of the Hanley fire as an antecedent to the Tubbs fire. It's happened in a number of places, and I think that some of the information there has to do with general meteorological patterns and wind corridors and fuel systems and ignition potentials that all co-align to create extremely rapid rates of spread that really lead to the Markov chain process that I believe, I can't remember which, Carleone, I think, talked about it. Jack Cohen has really, figured out what kind of existing set of linkages occurred to create an urban conflagration. And, they do seem to be occurring in some places again and again, but I caution everybody to think about the presumption that since you have not had a fire in a particular spot, but it's got a lot of the ingredients that you've seen in other spots. You've seen those fires, but no fire history, let's say in the last 120 years. Just because it hasn't occurred doesn't mean it won't occur. And in fact, the fact that it has not occurred might lead to 2 issues. One, a fundamental, real disequilibrium of the ecology of the site, and a profound sort of, notion amongst the populace that's lived there that, fire is just not local to this area. So those would be presumptive, I think. In general, I think the maps are pointing to areas we have high problems, and that's one of their fundamental uses for prioritization. But, in the game of risk analysis, there's no spot with 0.
Yeah, let me talk to some of the slides about Oakland. I was chair of the Wildfire Prevention District, Assessment District, where we fought a major battle trying to do something about the roads. The problem is they are so narrow, you just don't have much room to widen them. And that's throughout the Oakland Hills. It gets worse. And there will be a lawsuit on every single property because you're telling the homeowner they can't build on their property. And they just, they felt it was just impossible. Those areas are fire traps. The slide you showed, there was a massive slide on that very steep hill. It's about 60 degrees. It's East Bay Municipal Utilities District. And it actually blocked Charing Cross Road half the way across. And what happened in Charing Cross Road during the fire, people were using it as an exit road, and a car stalled. And what they finally decided to do was to push the car off the slope, but it was too late. And the police sergeant, or wherever rank he was one of the ones that was killed there. A fire captain was killed arguing with the woman to leave the house because she was looking for her pet. And then there are lots of other problems. Throughout the hills right now, we're trying to fight to get people to quit parking on the street when there's narrow streets. And the problem is the fire engines aren't going to be able to get through there. And it's a major problem because they don't have much parking space, and people park on windy streets, and it's definitely going to happen again. I just want to say one other point about something I meant to talk earlier about, and it goes like this. Ask not what firefighters can do for you, ask what you can do for firefighters.
Hi there. I have a question about the mapping, risk mapping that you described for California, and that wind is now being taken into account in those, I guess, the hazard maps that are going to be generated. Is that the sort of, what's the source of the data and which wind speeds are being measured? Because of course the last talk showed how fast things can progress if the wind conditions are
Okay, so just to clarify some terminology, the fire hazard severity zones are indeed a hazard map or a potential exposure map, not a risk map. They don't predict which houses burn and what gets lost. They are presumably to have a notion of what the hazard is and then which mitigation measures would be required in areas to reduce that latent risk. Indeed, we are developing downscale climatology data, which is basically a reconstruction of the past fire weather over the last 15 years at an hourly interval for every day of the year for about 15 years, and translating those into not just fundamentals of fire weather, but some very key integrative indices of the fire potential, right? If you just look at wind independent of precipitation, you might have a day that's really windy, but it's wet. It's not a fire day because it's raining. So you know, the combination of relative humidity, temperature, and wind in a variety of different sort of configurations gives us a notion of what the fire potential or fire weather is like. We have not fully figured out exactly the thresholds of wind and dryness that will be utilized in the map. We're going to do some calibration against some known fire events where we've got recorded fire weather, where we've got that signal. Here's the fire weather, here's what occurred, and try to make some inferences between the two. But that'll be in the model development stages that are largely looking at over the next 6 months.
I've got one question too here. Give me just a second here. So Tom, I'm thinking outside the box, or maybe I'm just thinking outside. I'm not sure, one or the other. We practice a lot of things. We practice, stop, drop, and hold. We practice, okay, it's tsunami warning that might come in. What would the evacuation look like? Is there any argument about actually practicing true evacuation and going through those drills where we get into our vehicles and do leave or evacuate by some other means? Or does that just create chaos? And if it's a decent idea, is there any community trying to do that?
Yeah, there have been a lot of evacuation drills actually for wildfire. Santa Barbara, I know, had a few. They actually used to have like a raffle for a television at the end for anybody that drove down there. And of course, everybody has to have a pancake brunch there. So, but then there was also, I know Los Alamos did one. They had one on the web where you could watch the video. But I think, besides just the traffic, probably more important is for people to say, what happens if I can't get out? One of the strangest calls I ever got was from a grad student. I think Rich Walker's here, but a grad student from UCSB called me during the 2007 fires and said her parents are at their house. They can look down the hill and they can see the traffic stuck. They can see the fire coming towards their house. What should they do? And I'm in my office in Salt Lake City. So I said, do they have a pool? Yes. Does the pool have a cover? Yes. Tell them to get under the pool cover. And that's what they did. So, but that's not my job. I'm just a professor. And I hadn't talked to her for like 10 years.
So to put another wrinkle into the whole evacuation idea, the areas where are burned are now landslide prone areas. And we are in a geohazard zone as well for earthquakes. As I was listening to you talk, I was thinking about the evacuation routes that we would have out of our neighborhood. And how do you factor in all of these, it's not just wildfire that we have to deal with when you're talking about evacuations, like your input on that.
That's tough. Outside my pay grade. Yeah, obviously the event in Montecito, that's terrifying. I don't think anybody saw that coming, so it's hard to to know your exact scenario. But it is true that you do have to think about all the hazards that you might face. But I don't really know much outside of fires, so maybe there's other people that could talk to that. But
yeah.
Not to put too fine a point on that, but they were warned. We had a crew from California Geological Survey down there, and the county had a meeting before the storm hit. Santa Barbara County took it very seriously. They tried to evacuate as many as they could. So they had a lot of warning, and they just, lost the luck of the draw.
Yeah, Rich is alluding to a emergent new response system called the WORT team, or the Watershed Emergency Response Team effort, that is an amalgam of state and federal hydrologists and emergency planners. And they did do some real yeoman work because the storm was predicted pretty well. There's a theme here with regard to forecasting the future, and poor Yogi Berra too, is, meteorologists are getting a lot better at predicting the weather. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but they really have. In the last 10 years, there has been substantial improvements in meteorological prediction, and that included a relatively significant storm event that ended up causing a lot of that mass wastage and erosion in Montecito. They predicted the storm. They developed maps of mudslides and made these evacuation warnings. In some cases, people did not follow through with them.
Can I just add one more thing, and that is that they met with officials also from Ventura County because they weren't sure where that storm was going to hit exactly. They had a different experience with Ventura County. They took it a lot less seriously than Santa Barbara County. Lucky for Ventura, they weren't the ones that were hit. So, it varies. Even when you've got an imminent situation, you can't make people do things that they are resistant to doing. But Santa Barbara took it very seriously.
And I think there's a theme here with regard to that sort of uncertainty and probabilities, is that some folks are going to sort of shade on the idea that it's not going to happen. And what are the implications? How do we articulate what those implications are? Because you're always dealt with a lot of situations of false negatives, right? Where you say something bad's going to happen and it doesn't. And people really feel put out by this. And right now, there's an emergent policy with regard to de-energizing power lines. San Diego Gas and Electric actually has been doing this for a number of years. They've got a decision support system on it that supports it. It was very well received up until this year, where we had this extremely long duration Santa Ana wind event where they had like 12 days of some people without power, and the fire did not come there. Or, as was alluded to, I think, by John, there was a fire a little bit further north in the county that actually preceded their de-energization. But that's a real issue, these false negatives. It doesn't breed good feeling on the part of the public when you warn them about something and it doesn't occur. But it's hard to prove the potential of something if you choose otherwise, right? If you don't make the mitigation action and then the fire does come,
Okay, one last question here.
Yeah, two quick questions on the risk assessment and hazard maps. If the community wanted to use your hazard maps but take a more conservative approach to informing their planning, do you have recommendations? Do they just upgrade in the color scheme or add a buffer, assuming they have no one, on staff that can do this fire modeling for them?
So I believe that the question really boils down to what authority does the local jurisdiction have to interpret hazard and modify the maps as they see fit? And the statutes that are associated with this local zoning process have a section in them that says the maps can be extended or receded based on a finding of fact. And CAL FIRE has actively interacted with communities that have done exactly that. They've wanted to augment their zones in a manner that's consistent with the modeling. And we've supported that because recognize it's basically a classified system based on the entire distribution of California. And if City X says that the threshold for very high, we want it higher than that, because you develop that threshold based on everywhere in California. And we don't care about everywhere in California. We care about our city. That is within their statutory authority. But recognize that being zoned into these fire maps has people that like it and some people that don't. I've found anecdotally that usually when things cost people money, they tend to not like it. When they think that they can get some benefit out of it, they do. So, there's definitely a role for local government to sort of define their own risks.